pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Tonight I'm going to do my November wrap-up. And I'm going to do it a little bit more scatterbrainedly than I usually do because I just am feeling a little bit stressed with all I've got on my plate between now and when I go home to Canada on December 20th. So I haven't put the usual amount of preparations I usually do, but I'm just going to push myself through it and let the chips fall where they may. I'm going to be doing a separate bail wrap-up. I bailed on more books this month than I read. Badge of honor. And I have 3 books that I hated, so if you might want to check to see what the first 3 books on my books mentioned list is in the show notes to make sure that I'm not going to offend you, because I hated these books. The first one I have already done a separate review on. It's Junichiro Tanazaki's The Key. Short little book, piece of crap. How ashamed he should be of having produced this after having written the masterpiece, The Makioka Sisters. He's managed to write a story about a love triangle involving a married couple and their daughter's quote-unquote boyfriend, and diary keeping and spousal rape, and managed to make it boring because he wrote it so badly. Never mind how much of it was offensive. Toilet paper! If you want to hear more of my vitriol, please check out my review. Any Mary Oliver fans in the house tonight? I had never read her, and everybody in book, podcast, and I don't remember if it's BookTube and Litsyland just worships the lady. So I found an audiobook of hers on TuneIn called At Blackwater Pond, Mary Oliver Reads Mary Oliver. So probably the first mistake was she shouldn't read her own poetry. She sounds like a mean old spiteful grandma who's trying her best to impart wisdom, but it comes out as a lecturing drivel. So I couldn't separate her tone of voice from the poetry, but I hated the poetry too. She's famous for this line, which I quite like, that one of her poems ends with the line, "What shall you do with your one wild, precious life?" What I shall be doing with my one wild, precious life is avoiding any further contact with her writing. Ooh. And finally, this collection of short stories, Girlfriends, Ghosts, and Other Stories by Robert Walzer. This is another NYRB classic failure for Sean the Book Maniac. And I was surprised because the first story, from 1907, it's called A Morning, is the best piece of fiction I have ever read about the workplace. What do you think? Should I read it in a separate video? Will I get in trouble, copyright-wise? It really is delightful. It's 6 pages long. And I, belly laughed at this story. And then the rest of it are these one-page, they're all pieces he published in some journal or newspaper. They are mind-numbingly boring, earnest, simpering pieces about love, and I think it's trying to write about sexuality, but he doesn't even come close to approaching the topic, and philosophy, and observing birds and children, and it's just so boring! I hate/scan read the rest of the book, and I count that as a read rather than a bail, but what a disappointment. There was absolutely nothing else in here that matched the hilarious, rollicking tone of this first story. So there might be other books out there by him that I should try, but I'd be hard-pressed to do so. So that's my last book that I hated this month. So let's move into more positive territory. So I don't have any books that I didn't like. I only had 3 books that I hated, and the next category, which equates to a 3-star read, are books that I didn't really like. And there's only one this month, and that is the novella The End We Start From by Megan Hunter. It started out really good. It's kind of a dystopian novel, and the writing, I thought the writing was really beautiful, and I enjoyed the fact that there wasn't a lot of world building or detailed descriptions about the dystopic happenings. It seemed to be that the waters were rising because of global warming, and so there was massive flooding in the UK. But it wasn't focused on that, and that appealed to me at first because that kind of a story gets really boring for me really quickly. However, both of those things by the end flipped to be flaws. Her writing drew too much attention to itself and was pulling me out of the story, especially since I think there was the page 112 syndrome, although I don't even think the novel was 112 pages, but the farther it went on, the less evidence there was of sufficient editing, and more of her flowery phrases fell flat than not by the end. So I was quite unhappy with the writing by the end, and I just didn't think the story held together, or I was not very satisfied by the end. But she definitely is a writer to watch because she can write. She wrote half of a good novella. And next, books that I liked, or 4-star reads, I only have one. It's a Chinese-American novel, Ha Jin, In the Pond. It's my first by him. And when was it written? 1998. I enjoyed it. This is the story of a factory worker in a small Chinese town. He's also an accomplished artist and calligrapher, and he is not happy with the way that the management of his factory are treating him, and so he becomes furious and attacks them through cartoons, which he gets published in the papers, attacking them and lampooning them, and they are laughable bosses, and they are so offended by his satirical attacks that they make his life absolute hell. It was interesting. I didn't think the characters were as deeply drawn as they could have been. It seemed to be just a satire. I didn't have the usual problems I have with it. It was an interesting story. I didn't mind the Chinese communist bosses being satirized. They definitely deserved it. I had no problem with any unkindness. That's the thing that usually gets me with satire. I just didn't find that this novel went as deep as I like my novels to go. But I enjoyed it. And now let's get to the best part. The books that I loved. I have 5-star reads. And most of them I have reviewed, so this is going to go very quickly. The first one this month was The Lost Garden by Helen Humphreys, a 2001 novel from Canada, but the novel set in the UK during the war. It's about a young, but not terribly young, horticulturalist who flees London during the Blitz to accept a position in the countryside to supervise a group of young women who are growing crops for the war effort. And her visit there coincides with Virginia Woolf's death, and this is the protagonist's favorite writer, and she finds a secret garden, or a lost garden on the estate, and that captures her imagination, and the writing is so beautiful that it's ended up probably being one of my top reads of the year. It's a short little 180-page novel that comes right up to the edge of being overly sentimental a few times, but not in a way that shook its solid 5-star read. Absolutely loved it. Please check out my review if you'd like further information. I've just put up a review of A Glass of Blessings, the 5th Barbara Pym novel. I'm reading them in sequence, so if you're interested in more about Barbara Pym, please check that review out. But this I think this might end up being my favorite of hers that I've read so far, or at least a tie with her debut, Some Tame Gazelle. Pee My Pants Funny, with some flashes of emotional power, which is the quintessential Barbara Pym cocktail. I haven't reviewed this, so I'll spend a couple more minutes talking about it. Fortune Smiles, the short story collection by Adam Johnson. It was already on my radar, but then just one reader reviewed it and said it was his top book of the year, or so he thought at that time. And it made me more curious. I found out I had access to the audiobook on my TuneIn Premium subscription, so I started it on audio. I did the whole thing on audio, but I was enjoying it so much that I found that I could get a Kindle version of the ebook for quite cheap, so I did a lot of it in tandem, listening and reading jointly. What an amazing collection of short stories. There's 2 stories about where the female characters are dying or have major health challenges, and I thought those were probably the most powerful stories in the book. The opening story I remember more vividly than the other one, where a woman is... Actually, I guess she's not dying, but she's they're not sure if she's dying, but she has this horribly rare, debilitating disease where she's basically bedridden and lost all sensation, while her husband... there's kind of a sci-fi element. I'm not going to try to describe it, but it was genius. I thought with kind of a little bit of sci-fi stuff in there, was I going to lose the emotional connection? I didn't at all. It was tour de force. And the other story where there was a woman who was dying or ill was also really powerful. 2 stories that I guess would be 4 or 3.5 star reads, but didn't affect my overall rating because so many of the other stories were 7-star reads. One was set in Louisiana in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, and that one didn't cohere quite for me. Yet, its concluding paragraph, I believe I quoted on a Friday Reads, is one of the best concluding paragraphs to a short story that I've ever read. Powerful. So maybe if I reread the whole story, I would have a different experience of it, but it wasn't my favorite, but its ending was. And the other one was set in it that I wasn't so sure about, was set in Germany regarding in modern times, and the protagonist was a former Stasi prison guard. And I found it really compelling, but I felt that the narrative acrobatics the author went to in order to put him in a situation with one of his former prisoners was so far-fetched that it sapped it of some of its emotional power. I thought it was a little bit, I would say, too clever by half. Maybe I said the 2 stories about the women affected me the most, but no, I think the one that I would have to say, if I had to only take one story from this collection, it would be the story about the celibate pedophile who was involved in some capacity. It's not so clear throughout the story, but he's involved in monitoring and helping thwart active pedophilic sex criminals. I was so nervous starting it because I don't like reading about that topic, and once I got part of the way in, I couldn't stop. It was probably the most honest story about morality that I've ever read. I think it should be studied in morality courses. It was profound! And the story set in North Korea was really powerful as well. So that was a solid 5-star read. It's my first book by him. I'm looking forward to reading more. I think he's only got the one novel out about set in North Korea. The other 2 5-star reads I won't talk about as long, but because I've done separate reviews, and I've just finished these up in the last few days. One is a novella from India, Gachar Gochar. Is it Gachar Gochar or Gachar Gochar? I'm not sure, but once you get about halfway through the novel, you realize what that means. It's kind of a nonce word. It doesn't actually exist. It's a private expression. A stunning portrayal of family life in Bangalore as India was rising out of poverty, and it's a rags to riches tale that has a dark side. It's a story that I will be thinking about for a long time. Vivek Shambag is the author. I don't think I mentioned his name, and he is a writer to watch. Please check out my review if you'd like more of my impressions. And lastly, this ended up being one of my top reads of the year. John Boyne, The Heart's Invisible Furies, a 600-page novel about a gay Irish adoptee, full of satirical delight and emotional power. If you want further gushing impressions of this book, please check out my review. That is my November wrap-up. Stay tuned. In a day or two, I'll have my bail report up. But in the meantime, thanks for stopping by.